Hello, Catherine. Good to see you again. Thank you for
Yeah,
joining
yeah.
me.
Thank you.
So, obviously, we've known each other quite some time, and I'm really interested in your story because it's a little bit different from everyone else that I've been interviewing. But let's start from the same place anyway. So, can you tell us a bit about your journey into Quakers? Thinking back, what were you seeking, and what did you find?
So I think so when I was a teenager, and for context, I'd been raised Catholic, so I'd gone to mass every week, I'd gone to Catholic schools. And then as a teenager, like most teenagers, I had sort of a rebellious phase, of, well, I'm not going to believe in God anymore. And then I started exploring different things because there was still the search for meaning, that sort of universal thing. And at the time, I think I was about 16, I'd started sixth form college at Notre Dame in Leeds, which is obviously right next to the Quaker meeting house. And so I had a look and I was like, okay, this sounds good. And what appealed to me then are also the things that made me leave later because I was I was getting very into politics and activism. So I was like, oh great. Well, everyone thinks what I think. That's good. And at the same time, I was going through the sort of new age buffet thing where you read a lot of comparative religion, you go, oh well, everyone believes the golden rule, that's good enough. And well, everyone worships a god, that's fine enough. And just kind of picking and choosing all of the nice bits in a very unstructured way. And so all of that mixed together, and it felt like a way for me to channel all of that in a community and in a slightly more formal way.
So what did you? So tell us a bit about those early experiences of going to meeting then. I mean, the good bits and the bad bits. Is, as you say, you kind of you found it wasn't quite working for you. Can you tell us anything more about the detail of that?
Yeah, so I remember it took me a while to get used to the actual meetings because sitting silently and still for an hour is still quite a challenge for me, to be honest. But I enjoyed very early on the thing where people would stand up and share. And this is again sort of one of the big sort of turning points because, being about 16 or 17, obviously I knew everything and I just want everyone to hear what I think. And that sort of that I don't want to say it's arrogant, but it's like I'm going to share what is important, and now everyone is going to hear it. That I look back on now, and I feel that's actually a great weakness. And but at the time, I really enjoyed it. And then, kind of outside of the main worship, because I don't recall feeling any great spiritual experiences. It was just a nice, still, quiet time. But then you'd get to know people, and then there would always be this sort of undercurrent of activism. So that was something that appealed to me. But then again, as I look back on it now, and I'll probably expand on this later, is it felt more like works-based salvation. And then in the sense that, you do all of this great campaigning and this great moral lifestyle, and you will earn enough good karma or good points to end up wherever you believe you end up. And then as I got a bit older and I began to think a bit more about things, I began to feel this real tension because there was such a feeling of almost moral or ideological purity that if you disagreed on something, it felt very strong pressure to conform to that. So being about 17, learning different things, always reading different things, encountering different ideas, which now challenged me, but not really finding an appropriate avenue to express that. And that kind of the conformity of non-conformity is a phrase I like to use a lot for different things. I found that actually was probably the big breaking point for me.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I'm coming up similar kind of views myself that I find there's a certain monoculturalism, as I call it, within Quakers at the moment in Britain, where you're told what the right opinions are. And if you go outside of that, actually it's not great. Um, let's go back to your story though. Could you tell us a bit more about, you said you were studying more, and I mean, when you say when I was young, well, you're not old now.
I'm
So
only 25, I know.
yeah. So can you tell us a bit about, what have you been studying and how has your life moved on, spiritually, if you like, or in terms of your work and your active worship groups?
Yeah, so in 2020, not 2020, sorry. That's when I left uni. So in 2017, when I'd finished college, I'd started uni at Bradford and I was doing peace studies. And when I applied to the course, I was still very much in the thing of, well, I'm going to study peace and I'm going to save the world, so there. Um, and then I had to like still do the course for 3 years. So I was doing a lot of reading into history and anthropology and conflict resolution, and it was still very interesting. And then, I wasn't really religious at that point because I'd stopped going to Quaker meetings, but I hadn't started going to church. And then I was suddenly in this place with lots of different influences. So a very big Muslim presence on campus, and other religions as well, and lots of different societies. And what I began to feel this search for meaning again once more. And this time it was different because this time rebelling against what was all around me, which was sort of very politically left wing at uni. Well, how do you rebel against that? Okay, well, I'll go a bit more right wing. So I began to kind of explore those ideas a little bit more and looking at sort of Christianity again in a more small c conservative context. It started off initially more as kind of a superficial look at, well, history and traditions and all of that. But then later I became more spiritually convicted of the actual the truth of Christianity. So then I embraced it more. And then over the years, left uni in 2020. By that point, I'd started going to the Church of England because, of course, now that I decided I was going to be a Christian again, the big question was, where would I go? Would I become Catholic again, or would I become Protestant? And this was a process of discernment and of sort of kind of theological rigor. And I realized that, when I looked at the Reformation and the core Protestant doctrine, that to me was more logically sound and had more basis in scripture. So I went to Bradford Cathedral first, and then moved back home after uni, where I currently go to Leeds Minster. So,
Gosh. So, and talk to me about your study then. Are you still I know you've got a history YouTube channel. So are you mainly a historian? I'm really interested in that peace studies beginning for you academically,
hmm.
but now you seem to have moved into history. Is that what do you consider yourself in terms of I don't know, I suppose the field of study that you follow?
Yeah, so I describe myself as a historian and a filmmaker. So yeah, so the peace studies thing is interesting because at first I used to think of it as a bit of an albatross of, oh, everyone laughs at me because I've got a peace studies degree. But now I realize actually it's given me a very unique disciplinary background because when every other historian has a history degree, and fair enough, it's sort of useful, but they're coming from the same disciplinary background, so they're being trained in the same sort of critical studies. Whereas peace studies was a very broad mix of, like I said, history, anthropology, sociology, all of that. So I approached things from a much different intellectual background and perspective. So, choose an example. Most historians would just look at a historical event in terms of, sources and the facts you can derived from them, whereas I now had knowledge about conflict resolution, cultural traumas, and how sort of past events reflect current events and how you can actually process and work through them from a peace building perspective. So, although that particular thing has not really yet entered much of my work on YouTube, it's something that I definitely keep in my toolbox.
Mm. So do you know how to create world peace now then? I mean, what's your, tell us a bit about the Peace Studies department in Bradford and the degree
Hmm.
that you did, because I know that that's going to be of a lot of interest to many Quakers who might not know much about it.
Yeah, so unfortunately, not yet saved the world. And the peace studies is interesting because I think most people, most Quakers especially, are familiar with it when it was basically C&D studies in the 70s. And now it's very much more about international development. So the majority of students are postgrads from abroad who come to study global development within that kind of that framework. And it's quite hard to describe. But when I was there, definitely the the stereotypical peace studies student of sort of, a hippie, uh, no longer existed because the focus was now much more on sort of tangible economic and global development around the world, and all of that sort of thing.
And and where are you left with it then in terms of your view of peace? I mean, what is peace?
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting because it's sort of, I came into peace studies very naive. I mean, very much of the belief that if we all hold hands and sing Kumbaya, then you can have world peace. And then I came out of peace studies, with this very sort of Hobbesian view of human nature. Not nihilistic, but an understanding, with lots of case studies that I studied over the period of the course, showing that there is this very Western middle class white liberal view of peace, which is that we all just be very nice to each other. And it doesn't work. And we studied the partition in India. We did all genocides. We even looked at football hooliganism. And even the biological underpinnings of aggression and violence, I don't think are properly understood by most people. And then drawing on sort of my faith more, is the understanding that, well, if you're a pessimist, you're proved right most of the time. So if you if you view that humanity, it's not that we are all bad or wrong, but we all have this propensity towards sin, that there is something inside of us that wants to hurt ourselves and to hurt others. And if we deny that, if we have a very sort of Rousseauian view of human nature, which is, well, we're all actually good at heart, and then some people go wrong, that's not very helpful because to go into some more personal things during my time at Bradford, um, one of my friends was murdered by one of my classmates. So, yeah, I know, sorry, big, heavy. Sorry to
Sorry.
drop that on you with no warning.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, I mean, this was, I think, just after I'd left uni. But I knew the people involved and I'd volunteered with them and various things. And it was someone who, you knew quite well, and suddenly they're capable of doing this. That there is this there is, kind of, to use a Calvinist term, this total depravity. And then at other times, so when I was a student, I was, you know, not just me, but on campus within the student community, there was this big culture of you should not walk around anywhere at night as a woman by yourself. So we had to walk in twos or threes. And on a couple of occasions when I was by myself, I was targeted. Like nothing happened, fortunately, but had I been more vulnerable or, not, or in a very desolate place, it could have ended very, very badly. So those experiences sort of shaped my views and understanding that, you know, bad people do exist and
Mm.
people do bad things. And if you start off from that understanding, I think that's a more appropriate way of viewing the world. So I realized I got very serious quickly,
Well,
but
yeah, and now that you've mentioned it, Catherine, can you say a little bit more about that? Because that sounds like a very shocking experience. And I'm really interested in you having spent so much time in Bradford. I mean, I know Bradford very well. I grew up on the very edge of Leeds, very close to Bradford, and I fostered through the Bradford system. So I saw a lot of what went on in Bradford over the last 20 years. And I suppose one of the things I'm interested in is individual spiritual formation. Um, so I mean, can you tell us now that we know you've been through that, one of your friends was murdered by somebody you knew. Can you tell us a bit more about that and what your, well, do you have an analysis of it, of some in some way to have you come to understand it? What, as unpleasant as this is, this has formed you really, has been a big part of your
yeah.
experience.
Yeah, so I did know all the people involved, and basically they all lived in the same house. The perpetrator I had shared a few classes with because they were on my course, and then they'd taken a year abroad and then come back to Bradford, I think, to finish their degree. And then the victim was a good friend. We both went to Bradford Cathedral. We both volunteered quite a lot because we were sort of very visible young people in the church. And basically, what happened is he just got drunk one night and decided, I'm going to murder everyone in my house. So he killed her, and uh, he tried to attack someone else who lived there. I didn't know her, but she survived. And then one of my other friends at the time, who normally lives in that house, was away that night, and so has spent a long time dealing with survivor's guilt. So yeah, I mean, it's strange because talking about it now, it did happen so long ago, but it did form for me a lot of my views on crime and punishment. And yeah, and tying into like what I did at peace studies and just this understanding that, we all have the capacity to do terrible things. We have this great potential for violence. If you look at any genocide in history, it's comforting to think that it's all just bad people who do that. It's not, it's ordinary people.
Mm.
And to believe that, well, it's only just a few bad apples who turn bad in childhood because of their environment. It can explain some things, but it doesn't get to the root of the human condition, which is sort of like a deep moral, spiritual sickness, really, which is why I come from more of a reformed Calvinist theology, which is that sort of, people are nasty, short, brutish, and that kind of thing. But it's for me, it's better to start from that and then find the goodness in people, to start from the assumption that everyone is just good and well behaved, but then they all turn bad later.
Gosh, it's so interesting, so interesting. I mean, we're talking now at the beginning of 2025, and we've got a new, Trump is in back in power for the second time. And in this country, we've got a kind of reform coming through with Nigel Farage still at the helm. Who knows if people watch this back in a few years' time, what will have happened? Um, I'm just so interested in what do you make of peace across the world and in this country now, given your particular perspective and experience.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's what does peace look like? And I think this is one of the another one of sort of the issues I found is because I'm very working class, I live in council estate in East Leeds, and then I go to the very nice Headingley, which is all very hip and studenty, and met by generally quite sort of middle class liberal Quakers who sort of just didn't have the life experience that I did.
No.
And I think even on a domestic level, our social cohesion has just completely been obliterated. You know, every time I go on the bus, someone is blasting music on their phones. And sometimes I'm brave enough to tell them to turn it down, but then I think, what if they decide to stab me? And I think a lot of people would just wave that away because they either don't get on a bus because they don't need to, or they go, oh well, it's not really a problem. So, that's a very kind of micro example of that is not a peaceful situation when you have constant low level antisociality in public.
Do you know,
Yeah.
can I just jump in there? Because
Yeah.
obviously I was in Leeds for 20 years and I remember having this whole meditation once and I spoke about it in Quaker meeting and people didn't really get it. And I was talking about, this notion about using a donkey for transportation
Yeah.
in the Bible was considered, I think it was reflecting that real kind of, working class poverty kind of mode of transport. And and how getting on the bus is still that kind of that's how ordinary people live, certainly the working class. And I remember, you see all of life on the bus. And I used
Mhm.
to spend a lot of time on the bus in Leeds. Um, so tell me about your concerns about social cohesion then, and because I'm interested in what your view of what the issues are, and I'm just so fascinated about why the majority of Quakers don't see what you were seeing, because
Mm.
that's really what I want to bring out. You know.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of different drivers. I think, yeah. So, like another example of it is what I call the tyranny of the lanyard, where it's like, oh, not my job, mate. Council's got to do that. Where there is no longer this sense of sort of interpersonal duty to each other. And I think, in Inspector Calls, J.B. Priestley had this great line of, we are a society, we have a duty and obligation to each other. And if you don't respect it, you'll be taught it in fire and blood. And there's so many little examples of this in that society is extremely atomized. So if you're waiting at a platform at the train station, the train comes in, increasingly people will try to barge their way in instead of waiting for people to get off. And then, yeah, and you go on the train and people will blast their music. And it's because culture has become very me, 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 me. And there is no longer a strict enforcement of social norms. And that's the thing, all of the values that we enjoy, they have to be enforced if they want to remain. Um, and so so I wrote this piece recently describing my daily bus trip, which goes from Seacroft in Leeds to the centre. So I'm passing through Gipton, Harehills, and it's just the level of degradation that I see every single time on a bus. Most people will never encounter if they live in the nice parts of Leeds. And so sometimes it's hard to put in concrete examples this general feeling that society is coming apart at the threads. But there is this feeling that, you know, you are sort of like a sole little atom bumping around with these other little atoms. And that really if push came to shove, if we were to see something like a Children of Men scenario, what would it actually look like? And that's what scares me, I think.
I don't know that what are you referring to there? The children of
Oh,
men
there's
scenario.
a book and a film called Children of Men. It's like a post-apocalyptic thing. Um, but it's very, very bleak and it's because it's set in Britain, it's much more relatable than sort of American
Mm.
apocalyptic stories. Um, but yeah, and so it's I mean, I've been struggling with it with my mental health, this feeling of kind of depression and alienation and stuff. Um, and like little tiny bits, like if you go to a fast food place where they have a clearly marked bin where you put your trays and your rubbish, people will leave it because they don't feel as though it's their job to put to clean up after themselves. And I remember telling someone this, and they said, "Oh, well, if I clean up, then I'm depriving someone of a job." And I thought, wow, what sort of attitude is that? Like something as basic. I mean, it's what I always do because they've put a bin there. It takes 5 seconds to clean up after yourself. But people are so lazy or they're so selfish that they don't care. They don't feel a sense of obligation or a sense of wider social duty.
So I think much of that, I think the majority of Quakers listening would think, well, I agree with that. I agree with that sense of clearing up after myself, and I'm also a bit judgmental about those people who don't do that. So I'm not sure that that would be a kind of a big separation between what your average Quaker, if there is such a thing, um, is looking at what you're talking about in terms of
Mm,
social cohesion. I mean, I wondered if you were going to bring in an analysis around class, say, or race, or perhaps religion, or perhaps biology you mentioned earlier. And you haven't mentioned that. You're talking more about kind of cultural issues
mm.
around our
Yeah.
obligations to each other.
It's a good point. I mean, I think my examples are just expressions of that underlying trend. And I think it cuts through the whole strata in that society is fundamentally different to what it was even 10, 20, 30 years ago. And that is just an objective fact. If you look at the data on the way that Britain is made up today, it is different. And this has consequences for how we live. And I mean, I'm particularly passionate about class, so I'll just run on that thread for a while. So I'm working in the media, sort of in kind of the screen industries, and it is so overwhelmingly middle class because it is so difficult to have a living in this industry if you're working class. So you can't really have a full-time job at the same time because the work is very precarious and sort of antisocial. You've got to be able to live in the hubs like Manchester or London or Glasgow or Leeds. You can't have any sort of care or family responsibilities because you have to be able to just drive everywhere to different locations, and you've got to have a car as well, which is a big barrier. So all of these different barriers to entry. And at some point I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna go on YouTube because I couldn't really start a job in the conventional route. Now, you explain that to people, and their mental scape is still operating on when they did it 15 years ago. And they don't realize that the situation is a lot different now. And now what you have a generation of people where probably for the first time in British like modern history, they feel as though they have a worse quality of life than their parents. So you look at, say, post-war onwards, you've got the baby boomers who are born after the war, and you know, Britain is still a post-war poor country. Like, let's not forget that you're playing in bomb sites, but you
Mm.
get to the 1950s and 60s, you suddenly have the start of consumerism. You have all of these wonderful cars and music. And you get further on and you get all of this wonderful technology and you can walk into an office and ask for a job. You can't do that anymore. And perhaps I'm being hyperbolic here, but I think what matters is how people feel and perhaps the narratives which people construct about their life. So you could bring up the data and you could say, well, actually, if you look at the gross income, but what matters is that how young people feel is that their parents had it so good, their grandparents had it so good. And I don't think people realize that. And so I've gone on a little rabbit trail here, but there are so many influences on this feeling that, society is beginning to creak at the wheels.
So that's a generational and economic thread then, really. I mean,
Mm,
it is class as well. Um, but you're really getting a sense there that generationally there's a huge difference. Um, and the people's capacity to make a living and get a house and get a job and
Mm.
um
And yeah, and
yeah.
well, I mean, a good example of this is how basically your career is set when you're about 14 and you choose your GCSEs. So I so you know, you're still a child, you don't know what you want to do, but you're told to choose your GCSEs. And then you do them. And depending on the grades you get, that determines what A levels you can do. So I couldn't do A level history because my GCSE history grade was too low, surprisingly. Um, because I didn't have A level history, I couldn't really do a history degree. So I did peace instead. So one little decision sets you on these railroad tracks of what things you can do. And I'm only very fortunate in the skills and gifts that I've been given that I was basically to jump tracks and start a career as a historian and a media person. Um, and then, you get to maybe about 25, and all of the government schemes were there for 16 to 25-year-olds. And once you're 26, well, there's nothing for you, pal, but there's no schemes left.
Mm,
So you're
mm,
in this position where your life has basically been set on one particular working route. You can't get any support. And maybe, 20 years ago, you could switch careers quite easily, but now you can't do that, mate, because someone has 10 years more experience than you. They started on that track earlier than you did.
mm.
And that is, I mean, that's just widespread across the generation, as I feel. Um, and so, yeah.
So tell us about your YouTube channel then, and is that becoming a sustainable career and livelihood for you? And what are you doing?
Yeah, so I became self-employed in 2021, and it's slowly managing to earn an income from it. But the trick is you have to diversify. So I get a little bit of money from YouTube, but not a great deal. I do public speaking at local history societies and things. I've written a book about Yorkshire folklore, customs, and traditions, which came out a couple of years ago. And I've got a fellowship, which gives me some money as well. But it's all of these sort of different sources. And most years, I'm just under the tax threshold. And I'm very, very privileged that my parents are letting me stay in their house and live with them. Because if I had to live away by myself, I couldn't afford to do this. I'd have to get a job, which I probably wouldn't like to do, and which would not give me the time to do what I really want to do.
Mm,
And that's another example of really being working class in the industry. To be honest, if my parents were a lot wealthier, they could probably, send me money and then I wouldn't have to worry and I could spend years pursuing my art. But, as it is, I'm just very fortunate they are happy to let me still live with them.
mm, mm. So let's go back to kind of religious stuff or
Yeah.
spiritual things then. So I'm just wondering if you can say a bit more about where has your spiritual journey led you now to the grand old age of 25? How was it? Can you give us some idea of how it's shifted as you moved through your Quaker journey and then left Quakers into the Anglican Church?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. I mean, to not sort of repeat what I said earlier. I began to feel sort of unsatisfied really with kind of the three things that I've touched on, which was this sort of monoculture in Quakers, this emphasis on politics and activism as basically a means of salvation, as the most important thing. Because, you walk into a Quaker meeting house, you'll see leaflets about demos and what all the other causes before you will actually see a cross or any other religious symbol. And also the lack of sort of Christian doctrine. I remember speaking to a woman who was a Quaker in Bradford, and she actually left because someone had gotten out a Quran and started reading. And fair enough, maybe they want to read from that, but for her, this was really challenging because she's a Christian.
Mm,
So the Bible is going to be the only source of spiritual truth for her. So she left and became an Anglican. And so this lack of sort of Christian doctrine was really challenging for me because as I actually began to think about what what am I doing in worship? What actually does this consist of? I realized that this kind of buffet approach doesn't, it's not very consistent. And once you apply any sort of philosophical rigor to it, it quickly falls apart. Um, and I think because as a sort of very not analytical but argumentative person, I think through things a lot, and I realize that it doesn't quite stack up. So, like I said, left that and decided to go back into Christianity. Again, thinking through, well, Catholicism or Protestantism, realizing that the Protestant theology was sort of the core essence of Christianity boiled down. That for me, Catholicism had too much extra biblical stuff. Doctrines like purgatory not coming about until the medieval times with no scriptural basis. The veneration of Mary and the saints, to me personally, feeling very idolatrous. Um, so, going on to Protestantism. But when I look back at it over now, I realize that perhaps God was moving me through all of these different positions. So I was raised Catholic, so I'm very familiar with Catholicism. And then I became an atheist, so I know what it feels like to be an atheist. And then I became New Age, so I know what it feels like to be a New Age. I went to university in Bradford, so I know quite a lot about Islam. And so it's almost like I was being prepared to learn about all of these different beliefs so that I can more effectively talk about them or to people of those beliefs.
Mm.
I'm not sure that your mum's got a key.
Okay,
She might come while I'm out.
right. Sorry. I did say I had an interview, but
Never
um
mind.
so yeah, so I view it that even in my rebellion, even in the times when I rejected and insulted God, he used that to equip me with more knowledge.
Mm.
And so now I'm very, very into sort of theology. It's kind of like one of my special interests. And it's so funny because sometimes I'll go to church and I'll say to my friends, look, I read this amazing thing about aliens, and they're like, okay, here we go again. But but for me, having always had an intellectual pursuit of it, now I'm just in the position of trying to learn as much as I can.
Mm. So I'm just coming, if I can come back then to this experience that you had where a friend of yours experienced the
Mm.
reading of the Quran in meeting for worship and being, upset by that or alarmed by that, horrified by that. I don't know what she would describe, but she obviously then left as a result of that. Do you get the sense that from what you know of Quakers historically, like if you and her had been sat in meeting for worship back in the, 1700s, would you have been happier then? Would you have thought it was enough then? Have you studied what, George Fox and the early Quakers were believing?
Yeah, I mean, I think I might have said yes a couple of years ago because obviously in the early days it was more explicitly Christian, but then now I think the I'm still drawn actually to the structure and the rhythm, and authority is kind of a bad word, but what I mean is um the good thing about Quakerism is that anyone can say anything. The bad thing is that anyone can say anything, right? And now you look at something like the Church of England, where for 500 years you have used the same prayer book, the Book of Common Prayer, and people around the world will know it. And this is a great thing, actually. We get a lot of students from abroad, so we get Africans, Hong Kongers, Indians. Basically, wherever there is an Anglican church, if they're a student at Leeds, they usually come here. And because it's the same type of worship and it's the same Book of Common Prayer, they're familiar with it. So having that sort of reliability through time, that scaffolding, I feel is very, very important because when you begin to dismantle it, that is when you lose, that is when things like heresy, again, to use a strong word, that is when things start entering it. And so now I think that having kind of a firm sense of doctrine, which is clearly laid out, like the 39 Articles of the Church of England, and having a clear mode of worship, which everyone follows and agrees to, I think it's more beneficial.
So let's do an imaginary exercise then, which has just occurred to me. All right. So that you're like, it's 1650 odd, and we're sat in church and we're listening to the vicar give the sermon. And George Vox gets up and Margaret Fell's there as well. And you see this whole thing play out of the the heckling and what canst thou say, and you're a vicar who's gone to Oxford and you think you know it all, but actually Jesus speaks directly to me, and we can all be taught by the Holy Spirit directly, not just giving you money. And Margaret Fell is over there and you can see that she's thinking, oh my gosh, that's all so true, you know, and you can see all this play out. What what's your response to that scene?
Mm. It's interesting because, I could see where he's coming from, right? But then what I think, I mean, I'm older now, so maybe when I was younger, I would have approved of anyone who caused a scene. But now I'm like, oh, I can't be bothered with too much conflict, right? Now I think it's, I think the intention was good, but I also think there's a lot of mistakes in what he said. So, for example, all of this thing of what dost thou say? Well, as we've seen, whenever you look at the history of new religious movements, you get someone who I have received a new revelation. You are to have multiple wives. I am to have multiple wives, right? Um, I mean, all across the world, people saying, "Well, I have received this new revelation, and it's actually all about so and so," and people follow them. And George Fox was not a cult leader. He was really sort of a liberator, you could say. But it's the fact is that the vicar, whoever he was, had been through years of theological training. He knew what he was talking about. It almost feels like being at uni in the seminar, and you have a lecturer, and then you have an 18-year-old who goes, "Well, whatever you say is wrong. It's all about what we think." And now, you know, I think kind of it's not really how you should run a community, I think.
So what do you make this the sense of being taught by the Holy Spirit, and that it's only being really deeply moved and taught by the Holy Spirit in order to really understand the sermon or to understand the scripture, or what Jesus was saying, and that it's
Yeah.
only being, bathing in the living waters of the Holy Spirit that
Hmm.
we can understand these words.
Yeah, I mean, the thing there is that at the time, George Fox and all of those early Quakers, they would still have been Christian. They would still have been thoroughly Christian. And all of that of how the Holy Spirit works is fine, as long as you still rely on the Bible as a bedrock. So it's actually sort of core Christian doctrine that you need the Holy Spirit to help you understand parts of the Bible or your relationship with God, but you still have to rely on the Bible as your authority. Now, my issue is that for most Quakers, they don't believe in the Bible as an authority. So if you're feeling what you call the Holy Spirit, well, how do you know that that's a Holy Spirit? Without getting too dramatic, what if it's an evil spirit, trying to mislead you, right? There is no form actually of discernment other than what feels good. And that is I think it's a very, very dangerous way of understanding truths because anything, well, as long as it feels good to me and it makes sense, is not a particularly rigorous, you know, method.
Hmm. And I suppose one of the things that I've been saying to people is I worry that we've been caught up in progressive politics. Um, and that when you said earlier on about moving towards a conservative position in order to try to find some critique of what you were experiencing in Bradford. I mean, what do you make of me saying that Quakers have become more aligned to progressive politics than anything particularly religious or spiritual? And it bothers me, and I think it's gone too far that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was exactly my thinking that, yeah, I would say, again, to use strong language, they'd made it a sort of golden calf. And that functionally, it is no different to how, you know, some Christians in America might make conservative politics most important instead of God. You know, Quakers will they will, froth and have wailing and gnashing of teeth at how certain American pastors will almost make, money and Trump their god. But at the same time, they will spend more time talking about nuclear disarmament or whatever is happening wherever in the world at the same time. Functionally, it is the same. It is placing worldly affairs as the most important thing. And I mean, I think if you wanted to start a fight, right, you could say that, and that would challenge a lot of people. Because, you know, um, but yeah, and it's again, it creates a monoculture and it stifles really any sort of meaningful debate within a safe space, really. So yeah.
Yeah, because I mean I've come to the same analysis, and what stands out for me is that when I hear some of the um we can call them the powers that be. I mean they're simply people in jobs at the moment. They're not they're not our Pope or anything, but nonetheless the analysis that the people in positions of leadership at the moment, they make this analysis that the reason that Quakers have dwindled in numbers and are continuing slightly, it's quite a slow decline, but it's it is there. And they make the analysis that it's because we're not inclusive enough.
How could you get even more inclusive? I mean, yeah,
Seriously, they say things like we're racist as a church and that we don't treat seriously the damage that, former slave owning Quakers did and the plantation owning amongst the chocolate makers of that era. And nowadays there's certain elements of racism amongst meetings, perhaps, with subconscious biases and all of that. They say that we're quite transphobic. If you believe that men and women are different and you can't change that, then that's a horrendous transphobic thing. So that means that a whole low group of people over here find us excluding, that we're too middle class, we're too educated, and too many books, too many words. So we're not welcoming to a whole lot of other people. And that actually, that's the analysis of why we're dwindling. And I've trying to counter that by talking about this idea of I think we need more religion and less politics.
Mm. But absolutely, and that's absolutely right. And I think, I mean, what I see in my generation is that we're seeing Chesterton's fence in real time. So for those
Talking through that,
unfamiliar,
because I
yeah.
don't know really what that means.
Well, G.K. Chesterton, writer of the Father Brown books, he had this analogy where it's like, a guy buys a house and it's got a big fence at the end of the garden. So he goes, right, well, I'm going to cut that down because it's spoiling my view. So he cuts it down and there's a bull in the field. So the point being is that these fences sometimes they exist for a reason, that certain rules exist. And what I think is happening is that since about the 1960s, everything has been counterculture. It's about tearing down the establishment, rebelling against the old. And even now, like boomers and Gen X, well, are still in perpetual rebellion against their parents, despite their parents' worldviews having been irrelevant for 40 years. Um, but so yeah, so we've had decades and decades and decades of, well, that's bad and that's terrible, and we're going to rebel. And now you have people growing up in a world in which this rebellion is the new normal. What do they embrace? So use another example, the new atheist movement was very, very powerful in the 90s and the 2000s. Lots of like brilliant speakers. But here's the thing, right? Christopher Hitchens, dead. Bertrand Russell, dead. Richard Dawkins, nearly dead, right?
Oh.
You know, all of these influential figures that they're not relevant to young people anymore. And so now young people growing up in a world in which all of the Chesterton fences have been broken down, what do they embrace? That's why teenage boys are following Andrew Tate, because they want a leader. That's why everyone is getting sucked into different things. And so part of the problem is that for many Quakers, they are still stuck in the mindset of, oh, it's 1986 again, and I'm rebelling against the evil government. That was 40 years ago, love, Just everything has completely changed. And now what we're seeing is a rise in young people either identifying as religious or spiritual. We're seeing young people across Europe voting for right-wing parties when that has not been the normal for many years because it was just conventional knowledge that young people are left wing. The failure to actually recognize that for what it is as a sort of a generational zeitgeist rebellion is a big, big crisis.
So your guess then is that Quakers will not see any influx of these younger people seeking religious places because they're going to be more right wing.
Yeah, I think they're going to seek more for traditional religion, I think, because Quaker outreach is basically here's a political slogan, and also Christianity is too traditional and too stuffy, and we're open and free thinking. But for most young people, open and free thinking is the normal, right? To a young person, traditional Christianity is different. It's new in a way. So yeah.
Yeah. And it made me laugh when you were talking about, this older generation of which I am clearly, in the sense of rebelling against this authority. And I saw some headlines somewhere talking about, people being horrified by Trump and just saying they've got father issues, that they're just rebelling against this authoritarian father figure. And I had this whole thought experiment of, well, is Trump and all of that really just a new kind of paternalism? And it horrifies all of the left-wing populations. I mean, is that the kind of thinking would you agree with that? Do you think there's a paternalism?
Perhaps. I think there is definitely a move towards authoritarianism. And if you take the historical long view, democracy is an experiment. Full suffragism, full democracy, as in every single person having a vote, has not existed for that long, actually. Even like the introduction of the vote, well, first you had to be like a married man, and then, well, only to women over a certain age. So the full democratic system as we know it has not actually been going on for that long. You could say it is a historical aberration when for most of human history there have been kings and chieftains and emperors. So, some might suggest that there is a propensity towards hierarchical systems of government. I might be inclined to agree. I don't want to make bold predictions about human nature, but I think what we are seeing is a swing towards more authoritarian systems because they provide structure and meaning and explanation. And I think perhaps what is a good analogy for this is I suffer a lot from decision fatigue. So I hate going into Subway, right? Because I don't want to pick 50 different ingredients. I don't know. Just give me a pre-prepared sandwich. And it's the same principle in that modern life is all about self-actualization, about self-determination, and then choosing all of these different things when it is easier to have it all set by someone else. So an interesting thing we're seeing now is, women kind of rejecting 1980s era career feminism in favor of, well, actually, I want to be a housewife. I want to not work for 50 years. And feminism gives women the power to choose that.
Mm.
So if it's their choice, then that's absolutely fine. But it is the trend which is interesting of why are women now, some women, shall I say, now saying, actually, I want to return to traditional gender roles.
Mm. Yeah, I mean,
A lot
I
there.
think it's so interesting, and I think these kinds of viewpoints do need to be aired more within Quaker circles. But of course, they're also trying to get bums on seats, if you like. There's also this notion of how do we attract these younger people, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is that, why is it that you have moved away from Quakers, and why is it that you think other people um, may move towards Quakers or away from Quakers. Um, so do you think that Quakers as a worshipping group or as a church is not ever going to appeal to this new generation coming through?
I think it might appeal to some. So when I look back at who I was when I was 16, I think that's a very common type of young person which is still very around. And I think those type of people might still be drawn to Quakerism. But I think, I think it will just sort of decline and dwindle. And this ties in to a lot of sort of the decline of the Church of England and the Catholic Church as well. And there is a lot of discussion as to what is happening. So, and if I was to make any recommendations, I would say, I mean, this is a very bad word, say Quaker apologetics. I know Quakers have been very resistant to the idea of apologetics or of this sort of this evangelism based on, well, we are the correct one, because the whole thing is that, well, nobody is right, everyone can do their own thing. But now living in an age when people are more discerning and they are now seeking what is correct. And I think anytime you actually apply any sort of philosophical rigor to Quakerist beliefs, you realize that it is more sort of a lifestyle community than it is a doctrinal religion.
Hmm.
And perhaps from a marketing perspective, it is better to follow that route.
I mean, it's interesting because obviously I go into prisons and I try to, I have to articulate what it is Quakers are. And I call it a spiritual practice and a spiritual community. We have a way of sitting together and being together in community that we believe takes in perhaps those who are questioning, perhaps those who are confused, perhaps those who are atheist, and we bring them into a spiritual community and teach them a practice of centering down, opening our hearts to God, listening to the word of God, and then thinking about what that means for putting my faith into action. And that's what I'm starting to kind of be clearer in my own mind about what it is we offer. And I suppose it's natural then that some people will go through that as you did and come out the other end and go, right, I've had enough of that. Now I'm on somewhere else. But maybe we created a very helpful, you know, I don't know, a nursery environment, if you like,
Mm.
for you to kind of think through your ideas and experience that and, get all of that worship, that ministry out of you is to kind of help you clear your thoughts and
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think there would have been a point where I would have been embarrassed to say, "Oh, I used to be a Quaker," but I'm not anymore because I realize that, having experienced that, I have a better understanding of it than someone who hasn't. Same with my atheist phase. Um, you know, when I read it, a lot of Christian apologetics, and you can absolutely tell when someone has never actually been on the receiving end of that and they don't know how it sounds. But I have. And because of that, I can speak better. So I'm actually somewhat grateful for my experience of being a Quaker because even though I think very differently now, that was part of the process. And had it been missing, I might have ended up differently.
Yeah, yeah. And I didn't really follow what you just said then about the apologetics. Can you say that a bit in a way that I'm going to understand? What do you
So
mean by that exactly?
So let me use an example. So I've used the phrase works-based salvation quite a few times.
Yeah.
And just to sort of elaborate on that, one of the core, so the central difference actually between Christianity and other world religions is that it is not based on good works. So, you know, most other religions is very simple. You do good things, and if you have done enough good things, you go to heaven or wherever. But this is actually, in my view, a profoundly immoral system for a couple of different reasons. So, for one, if you are born poor or disabled, you can't do as many good things as someone who is born wealthy. They could just, create a cure for cancer, got 1 billion good points. But you know what? If you're a child and you die, well, you've not had the time to do any good things. So it's actually a very unfair system. Um, and I think the fundamental thing is, the story of the thief on the cross, right? He had done something wrong. He had been a thief, and there was literally nothing else he could do. He's been crucified by salvation-based systems, so it works-based salvation. He's going to hell because he can't possibly rack up enough good points. But because he acknowledges that what he has done wrong and he acknowledges Jesus next to him, he receives forgiveness and he goes to heaven. And that is why Christianity has been an extraordinarily powerful movement in prisons because we've all done wrong things, and when you're confronted with the ways you've hurt other people, sometimes you think there's no way I can ever make this better. But the beauty of the gospel is that you, it's done for you. So you don't then have to work. And I can understand why this karmic system is popular because, again, on a surface level, it seems fair. But like the show The Good Place, which sort of apes on it a little bit, I think it was a couple of years ago on streaming. It is, it's not very fair, and actually, it privileges some above others, and it makes life a moral competition where the very morally good, pure people will know, well, I'm going to heaven because I've done enough good things. And the people who stumble and they've stumbled for a while and they don't know how they're ever going to stop stumbling, they're told, well, sorry, but your debt book is pretty large. So
Yeah.
that's just one example. Um,
Yeah.
so that for me, that's a big, big problem. And Quaker apologetics in response to that, how are you gonna answer that objection? And I think now there is a strong tradition of the dialectic in traditional theism, Jewish, Muslim, Christian scholars arguing with each other. And because of that, there has been very good development in defending theological positions.
Mm.
But because Quakers are like, well, we don't really like to believe that we're right, so they just retreat. And unfortunately, that cedes the ground to the opposition.
Mm. Well, that's maybe it's partly why I've been drawn to do these videos to kind of get all of this out there and
Mm.
to get us thinking about these things and talking about these things. One of the things that it reminds me of, somebody else just mentioned to me, is the maturity of the Quaker faith. Is it Scott Peck who's talked about the different ways of religious maturity and we kind of think of Quakers as being in the final phase of that. Are you familiar with that?
No, I've not come across that.
There's this idea that, because Quakers are so critical and reflective, I'm probably not going to explain it very well if you don't know it, but this idea that Quakers are actually more mature than other religious types because we can be this, I don't know, above it all, if you like.
Mm.
We don't need the rules.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe it's not that mature, but I mean, I think it's almost like if you have a company which doesn't have any policies, um, eventually it's going to evaporate. And I think the the religions which are growing, not just because the amount of babies which are being born, are the ones which offer clear and defined structure for people seeking that.
Mm.
Um, and I think, yeah, anything which defines itself as not something else, and then also refusing to define itself in concrete terms, is going to have a very hard job.
Yeah, yeah. So let's finish then with you and your future. What is your religious kind of path now?
Well, I'm still learning. And I still see that I'm learning and that I'm going on a journey. I mean, I don't know what it's going to look like in the future. The past couple of years, I really understood that I've been given skills in speaking and writing. Um, that God made me his gobbiest warrior, as I sometimes like to say. Um, and so I've kind of been through this process of realization that I have been given these gifts that I should use them for good. I could use them for evil, but how you're not gonna want to do that, you know. Um, and so just seeing wherever that leads and where that takes me.
Oh, that's great. Well, it's lovely to speak to you again, and lovely to hear you talk about all of this and look at, with such insight. So I look forward to following your YouTube channel, and we'll put those links into the description. So hopefully you'll get a few more Quaker listeners of your channel as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank
So
you for
thank you
having
so
me.
much. Yeah, thank you so much for your time today, Catherine.